Good morning. Hope everybody's having a good week. Today, I want to run through a couple of things from the book and add a little bit of a historical overview, and then just look at a couple of things from the book and see how they're part of what I would call tropes that may be good, that may be bad, but we're going to take a look at them anyway. First of all, we're going to talk about the schools. And on page 89, Midge is talking to them, and he talks about this idea of the schools were set in history. And they were set in history to keep people warehoused, to keep indigenous people warehoused. And so they're going to do the same thing here. They're going to warehouse the indigenous people who have the dreams in their marrow until they can pull the dreams out of them. And once they pull the dreams out of them, that process itself will kill them. You also see some language stuff here, like growing up from the dirt like poisonous mushrooms. Friday, we're going to take a brief look at the language use because I think we haven't done enough of that. And Demoline, I think, has some great language use here in this novel. Running through the history of the schools in Canada, you'll notice that 1831, there were already schools. I'm not sure if this was the first one, but you'll notice that it ran for 138 years. This is a long history. And part of the history of the schools is the fact that, the purpose of the schools was to forcefully assimilate the indigenous people into European culture. 1850s and 60s, it became official policy. And again, you have to remember that this was official policy from Great Britain and Canada because Great Britain at that time was a Canadian colony. And as time goes on in 1892, you'll see that the federal government and the churches enter into formal partnership uh, to operate the schools. And so now, not only do you have the government in there, it's one of the reasons in the book there are the religious references to the people in the schools as well, because the churches historically were part of the schools. 1907, somebody said that there were lots of problems in the schools. It didn't seem to matter. By 1920, somebody says we're going to make this attendance for Native students compulsory. And that was the official policy for nearly 40 years until 1958. And then in 1958, you finally get to the point of taking a look and seeing, whoops, my bad, let me back up here one. In 1958, you finally get to the point of seeing that they were recommending the abolition of the residential schools. 1970, you'll see that some of the residential schools were transferred from the church or from the government to the control of the various bands, the various tribes. But we're again talking from the 1830s until the 1970s, where the force was coming from the outside and the native population really had no control. In 1989, there were disclosures of abuse at an orphanage, and in 1980s through 1990s, gradually they started closing them. The last government school was closed in 1996. The last one was in 1998. So when Demoline is writing about this, she is not writing about something just from the 1830s, just from 1900. We're talking about the 1980s and 1990s, something that I remember very, very well. And so we're talking about things that were very, very recent. We have a lot of apologies coming through from 1986 through 1994. We have this series of apologies where people, were people who operated the school or were churches who operated the school issue apologies, talking about how the church failed the students, how the church failed the Indigenous people of Canada. You can find all of those online. 1998, There was a $350 million healing fund established, and in 2008, there was a government launched an Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this seems to me to be a huge thing. I mean, the only other time I can think of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was for apartheid in South Africa. And so you have this situation where you've got an effort to bring the truth to light, and where you've got an effort to bring two sides that were on complete opposite ends of the spectrum, politically, economically, socially, racially, to be united, or at least to come to some sort of an agreement. And so I think that this, is a big deal. I'll just phrase it that way. And it's the phrasing I think that's really important. Truth and reconciliation has a certain ring to it, has a certain connotation to it. And the book kind of sets up what's going on in the novel. The schools leach the dreams. Historically, that's what happened. The schools were designed to forcefully assimilate, to take away the language, to take away the traditions, to forcefully, um, you know, try to turn native people into European people. Okay, and Midge and his people are trying to preserve the native language, preserve the dreams, and leave some for the future generation. The schools tried to beat that out of them. The schools tried to beat them out of them historically. The schools try to leach that out of them in the novel. And so I think it's a good mix of history and fiction, history and fantasy. And again, the idea of the language, the idea of Minerva and the language. We'll come back to this quotation again, but it's just a quick reminder that it wasn't just the government, the churches were involved as well. And I sometimes wonder here, there's a little allusion which sets me up for the next part of the slides here. Words the wires couldn't transfer. It makes me think of the Native American code talkers sending words over the wire. Um, I'm not sure that that's what Demoline was going for here, but it provides me a segue into the next section. Next section is the tropes. And the trope is anything used in a figurative sense that reoccurs. And a lot of times the definition of trope can be derogatory, in that the genre can become a cliche, it can become stale, it can become overused. I don't know if that's what's happening here, but there are certain things that ring familiar. I'll use that term um, in this novel with other things that I think people commonly come across in literature or in film. First of all, to run through examples of tropes, on the left, you've got the ticking time bomb. The ticking time bomb is, pretty simple. There's this timer, and if the timer goes off, the world is going to an end, or the building is going to explode, and 4,000 babies are going to die, or some terrible thing is going to happen as it ticks down. And always with the ticking time bomb, the hero finds a way to defuse the bomb, to cut the proper wire at the correct time. That's sort of universal. And we've had the ticking time bomb, or a version of it, since the movie High Noon in the 1950s, where the pacifist sheriff has to hang on and fight off the the bad guys coming into town, and this clock just keeps ticking and ticking and ticking. And ever so often, we're just reminded it's getting closer to high noon when all of the bad stuff's going to happen. Sometime a trope is specific to a specific novel or a specific television program. I'm an old man, and I can remember the original Star Trek in the 1960s, and I can remember, I don't know if it was a meme back then, but it was certainly something that everybody talked about, and we're going to call it as a trope. If you're anything of an original, Star Trek, the original series fan, you know that one of the things that always was true is when they beamed down to the surface, if there was an unknown character in a red shirt, that character was going to die. Scotty often wore a red shirt, but we knew who he was. If you don't know who the character is and they're wearing a red shirt, the red shirt always dies. And so that just became this running joke from Star Trek, the original series. It was a trope. It happened over and over and over again. On the right, you'll see the trope of the cavalry coming to the rescue. It's kind of the Deus Ex Machina. We've talked about that before. On the left, you see the border. And one of the things that I think is a trope in espionage movies and spy movies is this idea of you send in your super secret agent to bring out some scientist with a formula that will save the world, and they have had all sorts of adventures, and they're on the road, and they're a mile or so from the border, they're a mile or so from safety, their car breaks down. So they get out of the car and they start walking, and they happen to run across the only police or the only military patrol within 25 miles. And so they have to run to the border. And they're racing towards the border, and the patrol starts shooting. Perhaps one of them is shot in the leg, and he kind of has to hang on to the other one. And they limp across the border, and they fall down, and the shooting miraculously stops. It's as if they have reached the end zone. It's a touchdown. It's now a penalty if you hit somebody in the end zone. And it is just this trope. It happens over and over, especially in the older spy movies. And perhaps there's a Deus Ex Machina where, the good guy's military shows up just in time. But nonetheless, this trope of getting to the border and just being able to leap across the border, and everything miraculously changes the moment they make that leap across the border. This novel, I think, engages in a couple of tropes, and I think I have three or four. The first one is this endangered, lovable sidekick. Comic books have been famous for sidekicks for a long time. Green Arrow and Speedy, Aquaman and Aqualad, Flash and Kid Flash, Batman and Robin, Wonder Woman and Wonder Girl. Very clever on that last one. But I think you could take a look at Zero, Manchi, Rue, and Riri, and they could all replace each other. They are all lovable sidekicks. They all have some weaknesses, whether it's not knowing how to read, whether it's being a dog who can talk, whether it's being very very small or very very young, and we grow to like them. And then they are either severely endangered. Okay, Zero is about to die if Stanley can't pull him up the mountain. Aaron kills Manchi. Rue is killed in the arena. Riri is killed here. And the difference, I think, is that Holds is a novel for younger kids, so we can't have Zero die. But they're this lovable sidekick who is endangered and either dies or is, at the point of death. And it's the idea that, it changes who people are. The death of Manchi, uh, changed Todd to some degree. Rue's death caused Katniss to be a bit more violent. Riri's death caused Frenchie to murder. And Zero's pulling Zero up the mountain reflected the changes that had occurred in Stanley. Another thing is, and I've got this from You Gotta Leave Calypso's Island. For those of you who don't know the illusion, Calypso was this immortal that Odysseus lived with in the Odyssey. He stays on her island for 7 years, and he, seems to be having everything he could possibly want, but then at the same time, he spends half of his time on the far side of the island crying every day because he wants to go home. He wants to be on the seas. And I think it's the same thing here with the Lodge. They want to stay, they want the safety, but they know somehow way that this safety is an illusion and that they have to be on their way. And it's not just ancient literature like the Odyssey, excuse me. If you have read novels like The Road, they come across that fallout shelter. Inside that fallout shelter is everything they need. But the father understands that if they find the fallout shelter, other people can find it. So they take as many supplies as they can possibly carry, and they keep moving. Even in classic American novels like Grapes of Wrath, they come to the government camp. They have running water and indoor plumbing for the first time. They have a sense of safety. But once again, when Tom is threatened, they have to leave. And here, the lodge is the same sort of thing. It's safety, it's warmth, but they have to leave. And Frenchie understands that perhaps it's better that they leave, but it's still a chunk of, we have to get out of here. And then I talked about this on the previous presentation, but the idea of wisdom from a fool. Minerva does all sorts of things that are kind of weird. She saves lids from cans. She's captivated by shadows from the fire. And she has her off days. All right. And by off days, I think they're talking not just physically, but emotionally. And even if you take a look at the scene where she's captured, it seems as if she is almost childish, that senility or Alzheimer's or something has set in. And yet, if you look at page 173, it was her gift, her secret, her plan. There seems to be some wisdom coming from the simplicity that's inside Minerva. That all of this simplicity, all of this foolishness is leading to wisdom. And as I said in the previous presentation, remember that Minerva is the goddess of wisdom in Greek mythology. And I think that that wisdom, that name is selected to show wisdom, even though she's acting foolishly. And again, wisdom from a fool is a trope. Perhaps it's a type if you want to, but we see it in a lot of literature. King Lear's fool, for example, utters words of wisdom that Lear should be following. Finally, I don't know where to put this, so I'm putting it here. I do have a question about, are there too many happy endings? I want there to be a happy ending for these people. I like these characters. They have suffered. They have been treated cruelly and unjustly. But there are a lot of happy endings here. We have Chai Boy and Wob having a baby. We have Rose and Frenchie being together. We have Midge reunited with Isaac. We have Isaac being the new key because he's dreaming in the old language. They're relatively safe. And there's a youth council established so that the future is being protected, that the stories are being held onto. That's a lot of happy endings. And I think this novel is set up for a sequel. Demoline doesn't seem to have written one yet that I can find, but perhaps not. Perhaps we're going to have the happy ending and just leave it. I'm not sure. Okay. On Friday, we're going to spend some time talking about the language, but for right now, this should do it. Remember also there's a quiz on Friday. Hope to see you then.